Hello, this is going to be the next installment on the sermon series I've been doing in Romans. We are up to Romans Romans chapter 9, verses 25 through 33 today. If you'd like to follow along in your Bible, it would make it easier to track with what I'm saying here. And I'm reading from the New King James Version, as usual. So Romans 9 verses 25 through 33, where Paul writes, "As he," that is, as God, says in Hosea, so he's quoting from the book of Hosea, "I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who was not beloved." And that's from Hosea chapter 2, verse 23, from the Septuagint. And then Paul quotes from Hosea again, another quote, in verse 26, where he writes, "And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, 'You are not my people,' there they shall be called sons of the living God." And that's a quote from Hosea chapter 1, verse 10. And then Paul, in verse 27, he quotes from Isaiah. He says, "Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel." And then he quotes Isaiah 10, verses 22 and 23. So here he's quoting Isaiah. "Though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord shall make a short work upon the earth. And as Isaiah said before," and he quotes Isaiah chapter 1, verse 9, "unless the Lord of the Sabaoth," or let's go with that pronunciation. "Unless the Lord of the Sabaoth," that's how I normally say it, but I'm probably saying it wrong, "had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom. We would have been made like Gomorrah." And that's the end of the quote of Isaiah. And then Paul asks in verse 30, "What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. But Israel," so he's contrasting Gentiles, the situation of the Gentiles with Israel. So he says in verse 31, "But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness." Why? "Because they did not seek it by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone, as it is written." He's quoting from Isaiah 8:14 here. "Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and rock of offense." And now he's quoting from Isaiah 28:16 in the Septuagint version, "and whoever believes on him will not be put to shame." Now, in our last lesson, we concluded by pointing out that despite Paul's analogy about the potter and the clay, from Romans 9 verses 21 through 23, despite that passage being misunderstood by many Christians to teach determinism, the passage teaches no such thing. Paul may have referred to Pharaoh as a biblical example of someone that God used in order to say that, like Pharaoh, unbelieving Jews and Gentiles can only blame themselves for their current spiritual condition. They can't blame God for it. Unbelievers, whether they be an Egyptian Pharaoh or a Jew or a Gentile, unbelievers make themselves to be vessels of wrath. But people who believe, people who believe with a readiness to obey, regardless of their ethnicity, they have opened themselves up to being God's vessels of mercy. in other words, God's vessels of mercy are those who receive God's mercy and then extend it to others on his behalf. Now, if such vessels of mercy persevere in living faithfully for God, then they will attain to the glory that God had prepared for them from the foundation of the world. And for proof of such mercy, Paul, in this passage, he first turns to Hosea, and he quotes, he gives two quotes from Hosea. Looking closer at verse 25, where Paul wrote, "As he," that is, as God, says also in Hosea, "I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who was not beloved." And that's Hosea 2, verse 23 from the Septuagint version. Now, in the book of Hosea, God told Hosea to name his son Lo Ami, if I'm saying that correctly. That's Lo Ami. That's Hosea chapter 1, verse 9. He told Hosea to do that. Name your son Lo Ami, which means not my people. And this is symbolically describing Israel. And he told Hosea to name his daughter Lo Ruhamah. And that's found in Hosea chapter 1, verse 6, which means unpitied. And this is a symbolic name, describing, in context, it's describing Israel. But, again, in context, it was just to be a temporary state, a temporary condition with Israel. They were eventually to be restored. But yeah, God had called them not my people and unpitied. But he wanted to restore them. But here in Romans 9, Paul's taking these symbolic verses about the Israelites and he's applying them to the situation of Gentiles being grafted into the family of God. And so Paul is, in the book of Romans here, he's writing, at this point, he's writing to primarily the Jews in Rome, the ethnic Jews in Rome, in the church who are reading his letter. They were familiar with the Old Testament, and so they would have discerned Paul's glaring misapplication, where he's taking these verses that are describing Israel's condition, and he's applying them to the situation of the Gentiles being grafted into the family of God. Now, the man Hosea, he was a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. And in the book of Hosea, God is pursuing an unfaithful Israel because he loved her, despite her unfaithfulness. And he wanted to redeem her. He wanted to redeem this northern nation of Israel. They had apostatized. Israel was God's people, but through her unfaithfulness, she became not God's people. She became Lo Ami. And yet, God redeems them, to once again make them God's people. He makes them God's people once more. And, he didn't just make them his people, he made them his children, as Paul wrote in verse 26, Romans 9, verse 26, where he's quoting from Hosea chapter 1, verse 10, from the Septuagint version. So Paul writes in verse 26, he says, "And it shall come to pass in the place," which is probably Assyria, "it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, 'You are not my people,' there they shall be called sons of the living God." And so here by quoting Hosea, Paul seems to be saying that, if God can change Israel's status at will, reversing it from being not his people to once again being his people, then God can change the status of the Gentiles who had been strangers from God all along. You know, they had not apostatized like Israel had. You know, and in 1 Peter, he seems to do this same thing. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 10, Peter writes, "Who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy." So Peter seems to be, you know, doing the same application of Hosea, this language used in Hosea, you know, applying it to Gentiles. And, you know, I'm not going to read it, but in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 through 11, that passage, it makes it sound like this status change for the Gentiles. It makes it sound like this was God's plan all along. But many, or maybe most ethnic Jews, they would not accept this idea, you know, of all these Gentiles coming into the people of God. You know, and it bothered Paul. And so he's writing to them, addressing the issue. And so Paul switches now from, he quotes Isaiah a couple times. He quotes Hosea a couple times, and now he starts quoting Isaiah. He quotes Isaiah 4 times in this passage that we're covering here. In Romans 9, verse 27, Paul says, "Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea." That's in reference to some passages in Genesis where God makes this promise to Abraham. So Paul says, quoting Isaiah, "Though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant, or possibly a remnant, will be saved." That's Isaiah 10, verse 22, the first part of verse 22, from the Septuagint. So, although Paul's fictitious Jewish opponent that he brings in from time to time in his writing here, although this opponent may have accused God of failing to fulfill his ancient promises to Israel, Paul uses this passage from Isaiah to prove otherwise. God predicted through Isaiah that although the Israelites were as numerous of the sand of the sea, and that is what God promised Abraham in Genesis 22, God predicted that only a remnant of them would be saved. And in context, you know, in Isaiah, being saved, it means that they would, you know, they would survive being conquered by the Assyrians. It's not necessarily saying that they would be eternally saved. But then Paul makes a wider spiritual application of this verse from Isaiah. You know, but, you know, God's promise to Abraham about the number of his physical descendants, it did not fail. But God, you know, certainly never promised that everyone who was a physical descendant of Abraham or of Jacob or of Israel, he didn't promise that all of them would be saved eternally despite their unbelief and evil behavior. Election, the concept of election, it doesn't do this. It doesn't work that way. Listen to what Origen had to say, anyway, about Romans 9, verse 27. Origen wrote this, and he flourished between the year 200 and 254. So Origen wrote, "Indeed, the prophet," Isaiah, "foreseeing the future, recognized that the majority of Israel would become vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. This is especially true of those he compared to the sand of the sea. This was due to their own hardened and unrepentant hearts, for they did not believe. They did not believe in order to preserve their lives. Origen says, instead they crucified the Lord of majesty. Isaiah says that although they were like the sand of the sea, only a remnant would be saved. And Origen means, he's adopting Paul's spiritual application, meaning he's understanding the word that being saved is being spiritually saved, eternally saved. And then moving on from verse 27, moving on to verse 28. Verse 28, there's some interesting things about it. There's a translation issue. In verse 28, when you're looking at a Bible that is a majority text Bible or a translation that comes from the Textus Receptus or majority text family, verse 28 is a little bit longer than if you were using a critical text translation. The New King James Version, for instance, it translates it this way: for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. And the critical text version would read, the Lord will finish the work and cut it short upon the earth. So it's a shorter verse. But in Isaiah, this in context, it may simply mean that God will carry out his threatened judgment on Israel, judging Assyria, or I should say, he's carrying out his judgment on Israel using Assyria as the instrument of judgment, using Assyria, as the sword of the Lord. But as far as how to translate these words, the usual Greek word that is translated into the English word work, it's usually the Greek word ergon. Now, depending on whether you're reading from a majority text translation or version or a critical translation, you might see the English word work once or twice in this verse. And instead of work, the word work, other translations use the words like instead of work, they use matter or sentence or account or reckoning. And again, depending on the version, you'll see this taking place once or twice in verse 28. But the Greek word, the literal Greek word that's used here, again, once or twice, depending on whether you're using a critical text or majority text translation, the Greek word that's used here is the word logos. It's not ergon, it's logos, which is normally translated word, not work. So that's interesting. So Romans 9:28, it is a quotation of Isaiah chapter 10 verses 22b and 23, taken from the Septuagint, not the Masoretic. And this is obvious when you compare them. And the Septuagint uses the Greek word logos twice in this passage. So, therefore, many English translations, for example, like the New American Standard, they have, instead of work, they use the word word. They actually, like I said, they use the word, the New American Standard is one such version that has word instead of work, instead of sentence, instead of matter, instead of account. The Septuagint reads, and I'm reading from a Septuagint version, the Orthodox Septuagint version. I'm reading Isaiah 10, verses 22b and 23 out of the Septuagint, where it's translated. For he shall accomplish the word, logos, and cut it short in righteousness. For God will accomplish the word, logos, and cut it short in all the world. Now, as for understanding what it meant that the Lord would accomplish or finish the word and cut it short in righteousness, or make a short word, or accomplish the word and cut it short upon the earth, the consensus of the early church, right or wrong, it seemed to be that it had something to do with Jesus and the New Testament gospel, the new covenant. And here I want to give you five early quotes from five early writers commenting on Romans 9:28. It's interesting, I think. Irenaeus, he's writing in the 100s, he lived from like 135 to 202. Irenaeus writes the following. He says, Isaiah speaks of a word that will be brief and short in righteousness. He says that God will make a short word upon the whole earth. That's Isaiah 10:23. Irenaeus says, this means that men will not be saved through the verbosity of the law. Rather, they will be saved by the short word of faith and love. In accordance with this, the Apostle Paul says, love is the fulfillment of the law. And he who loves God has fulfilled the law. That's Romans 13, verses 10 and verse 8. Irenaeus says, moreover, when the Lord was asked, which is the first commandment, he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your strength. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. That's Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40. Irenaeus says, accordingly, God has made a short word on the earth. It's Romans 9:28. And so, that's Irenaeus. Tertullian, he flourished between 197 to 222. Tertullian writes this. He says, accordingly, when he, God, uttered such denunciations as, you shall do no murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness. That's Exodus 20, verses 13 through 16. God taught me to refrain from doing to others what I should be unwilling to have done to myself. And therefore the precept developed in the gospel will belong to him alone, God alone, who anciently drew it up and gave it distinctive point and arranged it after the decision of his own teaching, and has now reduced it suitably to its importance to a compendious or brief formula, because, as it was predicted in another passage, the Lord, that is Christ, and then here he's about ready to quote Isaiah 10:23, Christ was to make or utter a concise, a short word on the earth. And so that was Tertullian. Theodoret, he's writing like somewhere in the 400s. Theodoret says, faith is what he calls the short word. For confession in Christ accomplishes what the law taught through many commandments. This short confession generates faith. In contrast, the lengthy law, talking about the Mosaic law, or possibly the Old Testament in general, the lengthy law that's probably what he means, the Old Testament in general, was unable to bring complete salvation. Chrysostom, he's writing, he flourished somewhere between 386 and he died in 407. Chrysostom says this. He says, what he, Paul, means then is somewhat of this sort. There's no need of fetching a circuit. And, that's King James Version. In Acts it uses, Paul, in Acts it is somewhere, it says, uses the phrase to fetch a compass. And it just means to take a circuitous route, the long way around. So Chrysostom says there's no need of fetching a circuit, taking the long way, and of trouble, and the vexation of the works of the law. He says there's no need of doing that, going to this length. He says, for the salvation is by a very short way. For such as faith, it holds salvation in a few short words. So he's understanding, a short word, not a short work. It holds salvation in a few short words. And then he quotes Romans 10:9. For if you shall confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. Chrysostom continues, now you see what this, the Lord shall make a short word, he's quoting from the Septuagint, from Isaiah, from the Septuagint here. He says, now you see what this, the Lord shall make a short word upon the earth is. And what is indeed wonderful is that this short word carries with it not salvation only, but also righteousness. Lastly, I'll stop quoting people, early writers, with Pelagius. He lived from 354 to 420. Pelagius says, the historical sense is that just as I shorten and finish off a sentence, so God will accomplish this with all speed. But in prophecy, the shortened sentence or word is understood to mean the New Testament, because everything is briefly summarized in it. So, David Brousseau sums up this issue this way. He says, so what does it mean that God will finish his word and cut it short in righteousness? It means that God will bring the Mosaic law to completion and cut it short by introducing the gospel. The gospel message is much shorter than that of the law, and the gospel contains only a fraction of the number of commandments as does the law. And it's interesting that God used the Jews in order to do this. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. And then moving on to verse 29, Paul says, and as Isaiah said before, or as Isaiah foretold, as some versions have it, in Isaiah chapter 1 verse 9, Paul quotes, unless the Lord of the Sabaoth, maybe that's how you're supposed to say that, unless the Lord of the Sabaoth, I usually say Sabaoth, I'm probably saying it wrong though, it's probably Sabaoth. Unless the Lord of the Sabaoth, which means unless the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies, had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom, and we would have been made like Gomorrah. So this word here that I'm having trouble pronouncing, a Sabaoth, it's a Hebrew word that the Septuagint did not translate as a Greek word, but it transliterated it. That is, it wrote it out by using the closest corresponding letters of a different alphabet. And Paul is simply following the Septuagint. So it says God left us, it seems, he's saying God left Israel. God left us, Israel, a seed. God did that in possibly a couple different ways. One way is that God preserved alive a small remnant of believing Israelites or Jews. The Israelites, the Jews, they were the seed. Like they were the Israel within Israel. Theodoret holds this interpretation. Theodoret says, those whom he, that is, those whom Paul previously spoke of as a remnant, here he calls a seed. Because of this seed, the prophet declares that the Jews did not suffer the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, for those cities underwent total destruction. So, could be referring to the Jews. And another way that God could have left them a seed, is with a capital S, seed with a capital S, that is by sending Jesus as a Jew to the Jews to suffer and die for them, as well as for the rest of the world. So, according to this view of things, Jesus is the seed. Origen holds to this interpretation. Origen says, yet it was not without reason that Isaiah referred to what was left behind as a seed. For a seed is sown in the earth, and then it yields abundant fruit. Through this, Isaiah teaches that Christ too had to be sown. That is, he had to be buried in the earth. Thereafter, he would rise to bring forth an abundance, the multitude of the church. So that's Origen's view on that. And concerning the possibility of Israel or the Jews becoming, like the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were totally destroyed, along with all the people in them, Chrysostom said this. Here, Paul, shows another thing, that not even the remnant of Jews were saved by their own resources. For unless God had shown great kindness to them and had saved them by faith, those few would have perished too. They would have met with the fate of Sodom. That is, they would have undergone utter destruction. For the people of Sodom were destroyed root and branch, and they were left without even the slightest remnant. So, moving on to verses 30 through 33, there's some interpretations here too with these verses here. As we get into let's say verses 30 and 31, we could ask. He speaks about the law of righteousness. Is this law of righteousness, is that the same as the righteousness of the law? And Paul speaks of elsewhere. And I mean, there's an issue with defining law. What law are we talking about? Is it law principle? Is it law with a capital L, with a small L? And define the word righteousness. There's some issues, and people understand these verses in different ways. But anyway, to get into it, in verses 30 and 31, Paul says, what shall we say then? He says that Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness. Even the righteousnesses of, or the New American Standard has the righteousness which is by faith. So he says, even the righteousness of faith, or the righteousness which is by faith. In verse 31 he says, but Israel, so he's contrasting the Gentiles with Israel. He says, but Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, or the New American Standard has pursuing a law of righteousness. And again, we're left with, what law are we talking about here? Is this a reference to the Mosaic law? Is he referring to, a law as in a principle? How to understand that is the issue. He says, but Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness, or has not attained to that law of righteousness, as the New American Standard has. So, as far as how shall we interpret this, the way I would interpret this, when Paul says, what shall we say then, it's basically, how shall we sum up this situation? And I think it's that most Gentiles, before Jesus came, that they made no effort to pursue righteousness. Some did, not saying all, but most did not. And yet, after Jesus came, many Gentiles, or some Gentiles, they found true righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ. In faith in Him as Messiah and Son of God. And so they received forgiveness and they got a clean slate. They discovered a better way to live by following the saving teachings of Jesus. And in contrast to this, in Paul's day, most of the ethnic Israelites, ethnic Jews, who had been living under the Mosaic law with its moral precepts, they failed to attain to or to fulfill the righteousness that is of the law. Because they rejected Jesus as Messiah and Son of God, and therefore they cut themselves off from the way of salvation and true righteousness. Because ever since Jesus came, forgiveness and blessedness is only found in Him. A couple writers address this. Ambrosiaster, he flourished about 366 to 384. We actually don't know who this man is. It's an anonymous writer. Ambrosiaster says, in ages past, the Gentiles did not pursue righteousness. That is, they did not pursue the law, which testifies to the Creator. However, at the coming of Christ, they discovered a righteousness that surpassed that of the scribes and Pharisees. In short, those who had never sought after the lesser righteousness of the law, speaking of the Mosaic law, he says they later found a greater righteousness. In contrast, the Jews were born under the law and should have benefited from it, yet they regressed. So that's what Ambrosiaster had to say. Origen, he says this, it is one thing to pursue something, and another thing to possess it instinctively. He says, a person is said to pursue something when he seeks to achieve it by instruction and reading. The Gentiles did not have the law written down on tablets or books. Therefore, they are said not to have pursued righteousness. Nevertheless, they had an innate understanding of righteousness taught to them by natural law. For this reason, then, the righteousness that comes from faith in Christ was not far from them. And to address the last remaining verses we're going to cover, verses in Romans chapter 9, verses 32 and 33, Paul says, why? Why has Israel not attained to this law of righteousness? He says, why? Because they did not seek it by faith, by pistis. He says, but as it were, by works of the law, by works of the Mosaic law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone, with capital S's. They stumbled at that stumbling stone. Verse 33, as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense. I think rock should probably have a capital R. So he's quoting here, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense. That's a quote from Isaiah 8:14. And then in the last half of the verse, he quotes from Isaiah 28:16 from the Septuagint version. He says, and whoever believes, whoever is believing, whoever is trusting, pistuo, on him, whoever is trusting on him, Jesus, will not be put to shame. So, just to address the first part of verse 32 here. Where he says, because they did not seek it by faith, but as it were by works of the law. In this phrase, Paul is not contrasting faith alone with godly works of obedience. Rather, he's contrasting, I think, faith, pistis, in Jesus with the regulatory, the civil, the ceremonial, the dietary works of the law, of the Mosaic law. Or possibly, and including possibly the many traditions that the Pharisees had built up, the extra biblical traditions that had built up around the law. As Paul said in the second half of verse 32, he says, for they, that is the Jews, stumbled at that stumbling stone. They stumbled at Jesus. And in verse 33, chapter 9, verse 33, like I said, is combining Isaiah 8:14 and Isaiah 28:16, Septuagint version. Now, about the stumbling stone, Origen had this to say. He said, we speak of a stumbling block when some type of obstacle is found in the road that hinders the way of someone walking. And so this is apparently what Jesus was to these Jews. They couldn't accept Jesus. They stumbled over him. Theodoret says about the stumbling stone, persons who do not look at their path are apt to stumble. This had been the case with the Jews. They were so intent on the smallest minutiae of the law that they chose not to see the stone with a capital S. They chose not to see Jesus, foretold by the prophets. And this was, even though it had been distinctly predicted, and he's referring to the Septuagint version of Isaiah 28:16, it had been distinctly predicted that, whoever trusted in him, should obtain the greatest blessings. And concerning the Septuagint phrase in Romans 9 verse 33, they will not be put to shame. When people have faith in something that doesn't work out as they expected, they end up being embarrassed. They end up being ashamed and disappointed. But this will not happen for those who trust in Jesus. They will not be put to shame. All of Jesus' promises will be fulfilled. And you have to understand that his promises are not unconditional. They are conditional. In conclusion, most, but not all, Israelites or Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah. And because of this, they, as a nation, were rejected by God. Jesus is the way. But there is a remnant, or an Israel within Israel. Some of them will make it. But in general, as a nation, the Israelites, the Jews, they rejected God's path to righteousness. And therefore, they ceased being God's chosen instrument. It was their own fault. We must not do it our way, but we must do it His way. And that's all I have. Thank you.